Hello and welcome to the programme that brings together leading British columnists and the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast from the Dateline London. This week, Boris Johnson and the art of political cross-dressing. Have electoral cockroaches begun stripping him bare? Is it safer to eat a British sausage than meet a British tourist? And as the poorest nations run short of vaccine and India warns there's a Delta Plus variant, what would a world living with COVID long-term look like? Joining me this week, Eunice Goish is a Portuguese academic, author and journalist. Steve Richards has been analysing British politics for 30 years, not just online, on air and in print, but on stage too. And with me in the studio is Thomas Keelinger, who spent the last half-century writing about British politics and more recently British history and trying to explain the British to his fellow native Germans. Welcome to you and welcome to Eunice and Steve. Good to have you back with us. Now, Sarah Green is proud to call herself a cockroach. The newly elected Liberal Democrat MP won Chesham and Amersham by ousting the Conservatives. The scale of the victory has alarmed some of Boris Johnson's allies. Miss Green now represents a leafy community on the northwestern fringes of London, an ill-dubbed Metroland. Not bad for a party nearly annihilated by voters during Boris Johnson's general election triumph of 18 months ago. But like cockroaches, they're still there, she says. Another by-election looms Thursday, days after the Health Secretary was caught mixing business with pleasure and not observing the COVID rules he himself is responsible for. Steve Richards, has a Prime Minister with an 80-seat majority really got much to worry about if the odd by-election goes against him?
Yeah, I think he has, because Boris Johnson's omnipotence, almost complete control over this government, is because he is perceived as an election winner. Even his most ardent fan would not say he was a great master of detail who implements policies with a sort of rigid focus. But he appears to be this great vote winner who will not only allow them to keep their seats at an election, but perhaps make more gains in the north of England. That by-election, where the Conservatives lost by an unexpectedly big margin, at least challenges that picture. And even if the Conservatives gain, as many think they will, the by-election next week in a red wall area of England, Batley and Spain, there will be a slight qualification. On one level, it's an epic electoral triumph to make gains mid-term for a government, but it will be seen as a light which says, OK, so we're doing extraordinarily well in those areas that were once Labour. But what about our traditional support? And how do we maintain a coalition stuffed full of contradictory elements? So I do think it was significant.
And we talked, Eunice, about Boris Johnson sort of riding two horses. On the one hand, he's made these extraordinary gains the last election in English Midlands and English Northern seats that were traditionally Labour, although, as Steve would know, Batley and Spain has been Conservative in the past, Conservative and Labour at different times. It's Labour at the moment. But these seats are also seats that he has in his backyard, as it were, southern England, where people are starting to become a bit restless. Is it possible, do you think, for him to continue this successful act of doing things to satisfy both constituencies?
I think it will be very difficult, when parties are in power. The longer they spend in power, the less popular, the less palatable they are for voters. So far, Boris Johnson has benefited from delivering Brexit, from being in total control of the management of the pandemic with all its mistakes, but it means that he's completely in charge of the communication strategy of the pandemic. We have millions of people on furlough, thousands of companies being helped by the British government, and a successful vaccine rollout program. So all of that benefits the Conservative. But the luck is not going to last until the next election. And this is when essentially the problems will start for Boris Johnson. And we started to see, as we saw at the last by-election in Chesham and Amersham, how the Liberal Democrats are starting to break the blue wall in southern seats, in typical safe Conservative seats. And as Steve has said, it's very difficult to create a platform that satisfies two very different sets of voters. And here, the big issue was the promises to build more housing. Southern voters in leafy and wealthy areas are not so keen on seeing big construction going on there. They also feel a little bit neglected with all the focus in the north. And at the same time, they no longer fear the Labour Party and a Labour government that in 2019, the threat was a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn. That threat is no longer there. So yes, those seats are under threat. And political scientists, they estimate there are around 23 seats in southern England that the Liberal Democrats can win back from the Tories.
I mean, Thomas, you'll recall very clearly 20 years ago in this country, the Lib Dems did very well in by-elections against John Major, then a Conservative Prime Minister, but the people who really reaped the political benefit were Labour. At the moment, is Boris Johnson's biggest advance at Labour's perceived continued weakness?
Well, I think it's not so much Labour's weakness, but the absence of public attention on anything other than the pandemic. Boris is lucky in the sense that, A, of course, there's a majority in the House of Commons that Steve already referred to, and secondly, there's also this overriding issue of the COVID crisis, which keeps everyone on tenterhook how it'll all end. You don't change horses, as it were, in the middle of a virus attacking you on a daily basis. Our predictability is ruined. I'm reminded of an old Jewish joke which says, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. This is so much our situation. Nothing will be as you plan it. And that, in a sense, is hard luck for Keith Starmer, because to carve out a profile for his party at a time when nobody is really listening for anything other than the current crisis is very tough on him. Also, the old cleavage between Tory and Labour, which used to be so prominent in Blair's time, and he arrived at don't forget, at the end of the long Tory cycle. And nothing like that obtains at the moment. We have a new ball game, political ball game, and the attachment of individuals to parties are very brittle and unpredictable. So Boris can ride his luck a little longer yet, I'm sure.
Steve Richards, the wider situation beyond England in the UK is very interesting in the moment, isn't it? There are signs of perhaps a strengthening of Welsh nationalism, but Labour seems to be pretty secure in Wales, judging by the results in the Welsh parliamentary and the Welsh Assembly elections, the Senedd. We have Scotland and the pressures on Scottish independence, which actually might, hard to know what impact that could have on the wider political situation in the UK. And in Northern Ireland, you have a kind of parallel political system where none of the main parties really have any presence, and therefore, arguably, governments don't really often take Northern Ireland voters that seriously. I mean, the whole package of the UK politics is very, very fluid at the moment.
It's incredibly fluid, and there aren't really parallels with the 80s beyond the fact that this is another long-serving Conservative government for the reasons you suggest. I mean, in the 80s, it's easy to forget, all power, in effect, was centralised at Westminster. There was no Scottish Parliament. There was no Northern Ireland and Wales Assembly. Now we have this very diverse and fractured picture, which adds to the uncertainty the other guests have been exploring at the moment. So you have this bizarre situation where the Tories are triumphing in kind of seats that were solidly Labour once, and Labour actually in those local elections a month ago, though on the whole doing badly, making quite substantial gains in areas that used to be solidly Conservative. This is in England. And meanwhile, as you suggest, you have these other developments. And of course, one reason why the drama over Brexit and the Northern Ireland protocol, which we won't have time to go into, is less resonant than it probably should be, is exactly as you suggest. The traditional parties don't really contest those seats, so there isn't as much highly charged fervour around it. But you convey very accurately a picture that is it's unprecedented. We're not used to this, and the outcome is very uncertain in terms of the next election.
I'm glad you mentioned the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it might fill some viewers with dread because it's such a complicated subject. But Eunice, we did have a meeting in the British Irish Council this week, the first time in 2 years they've actually sat down together. We had Simon Coveney, the foreign minister for Ireland, suggesting, as he had suggested the G7, that two sides might be inching together. Do you detect any signs of a willingness, perhaps in Brussels, first of all, to look for a compromise on this? Because arguably the distrust and the bad politics between Brussels and London could have really damaging consequences on the ground in Northern Ireland if it's not dealt with soon.
Yes, well, if there is an atmosphere of trust, I do not know. There was an upbeat mode and mood between the Irish Foreign Secretary and the Northern Irish Minister for the UK at their meeting, and there was the expressed desire to have more of these meetings, and they are necessary to keep good relations, good bilateral relations. But with regards to the Northern Irish Protocol, I think the EU, and I think President Macron expressed that very eloquently at the last G7 summit, there is a very great fatigue with Brexit. The EU has spent 4 years painstakingly negotiating first a withdrawal agreement, then a new cooperation agreement between the UK and the European Union. For the UK, within months or days of signing that agreement, or weeks of signing that agreement, to starting to renege on some of those compromises. So when the United Kingdom's government decided to unilaterally extend the grace period of the application of the Northern Irish Protocol, while at the same time it refused to recognize the EU's ambassador in the United Kingdom. This was all great irritants. So the EU might concede another grace period of 3 months where the protocol is not applied for the meat, so the sausage, the famous sausage war. And this is very much in line with what the EU does so well, which is kicking the can down the road, hoping for the problem not to be sorted. This is essentially the classic way in which the EU solves its problems. But there is a very strong fatigue. The EU wants to focus on other things, and it also fears that it's sending the wrong signs. It's starting to feel that the UK is not serious about its commitments in its relationships with the European Union, and it's also worried about what kind of messages it's sending to countries like Switzerland and Norway and Iceland, with which the EU has very strong relations. These are countries that are part of the European Economic Area. Switzerland, as a kind of not de facto, but in reality, is a member of the single market, enjoys the benefits of the single market. And these countries might want to say, well, we also want kind of bespoke agreements where we want a bit of this and a bit of that, because this is essentially what the British government is trying to do. It's having its cake and eat it. And I think Brussels is starting to be a bit tired of having the same conversation over and over again.
I mean, there is something slightly absurd about all this, Thomas, isn't there? Nobody really seriously thinks a sausage coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland is then going to end up in, I don't know, Portugal, be eaten by a Portuguese innocently and they get terrible food poisoning or something awful happens. But the reality is that a lot of people in Brussels are angry at Boris Johnson, appears to be signing in, they're not honouring it. They don't want to reward him, as Eunice says. But there's a danger, isn't there, of not seeing the wood for the trees here. Surely what's more important is stability in a place like Northern Ireland, the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, stability that could be threatened, and that people would say actually the EU and the UK and the Irish all have an interest in ensuring that doesn't happen. Isn't that the basis why perhaps some might take a more statesman-like view and say, actually, even if we appear to be rewarding Boris Johnson's bad behaviour, the bigger picture is more important. Stability is the most important thing of all.
It isn't about awarding either side for sticking to the negotiated outcome. This is a deal which has been signed by the British, and you can reasonably assume they'll stick by it. But you know, Ines talked about the way the EU has with kicking the can in the grass and waiting for something to happen. The British also have a way of doing business, which is muddling through. The Downing Street clan, as it were, never really focused on what the EU is. They have no understanding of the EU. They think it's the idea plucked from the sky to have the integrated central market, as it were. This is the be-all and end-all for the EU as a trading area. And so compromises have to be made, but so does Boris Johnson have to consider compromising. So far, he is making it look like it would be a dent of British pride if he gave one iota, and that is the danger. That will really inflame motivations and feelings all over. If he portrays the need for a compromise on his side as a relinquishment of the British sovereign idea about our own leader, that is playing with fire. That is where playing with fire occurs. So he has to educate his people. Something has to give here.
And there's an opportunity because he's got Angela Merkel coming to Chequers, his country home,
right.
to meet.
She's coming to this country in a week's time, discussing trade area, trade problems, and of course vaccinations and all the rest of it. But Johnson has to get off his high horse. This grandstanding of sovereignty and British pride and what have you, if you have a compromise with your partner, and that it dents your very standing in the world. The opposite is the case. If he compromises too, and he can eat humble pie in some small area, it will benefit him hugely and won't endanger his success in the British public opinion at all.
I mean, he could serve her sausage and mash, I suppose, for lunch, Steve. But, I mean, seriously, is there a way that Boris Johnson could say, OK, we will follow EU veterinary standards for an unspecified period, and he could do that and get away with that without Brexiteers, people who supported Brexit, crying betrayal?
No, I think all hell would break loose. It sounds relatively minor because the UK theoretically are committed to high standards. But if they, I mean, this is the Brexiteer case, that if they tie themselves to what's called equivalence with the EU, it defeats the whole point of their view of Brexit, which was to have the freedom to negotiate trade deals elsewhere, unencumbered by legal commitments to the European Union. So I think it will be difficult for him because it would be a challenge to the very arguments he has framed. The arguments are strange because any trade deal really is a pooling of sovereignty. The one with Australia involved compromises and rules, etc. But they have made such a thing about being freed completely from the European Union that I think all hell will break loose. However, there is no other solution because, as Thomas suggests, the purity of that single market, and it's not about an out-of-date sausage ending up in Portugal. It's about protecting that single market, means there has to be a barrier somewhere because Britain's left. And so it's a really big problem, even though the examples sound trivial.
Thank you all very much. Last week, we talked on this programme about the G7 nations, some of the world's richest, pledging to help the poorest by providing vaccine. This week, COVAX, the initiative to ensure poorer countries aren't priced out, said half of them are already running out, undermining the very effectiveness of vaccination as a route out of pandemic. Indeed, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa accused the rich of vaccine hoarding. India says it's identified cases it calls of Delta Plus, the variant which is spreading and is now taking a different form. As it evolves, of course, so must vaccines. Eunice, Mr Ramaphosa says South Africa is trying to get production somewhere on the continent of Africa because the vaccination levels in Africa are vanishingly small. In those circumstances, is it enough for the rich countries to say, well, look, let's waive patent laws, and people have talked about that as an option, or for the G7 countries to say, look how generous we are, we're providing 1 billion doses in over the next year or so? Is that any adequate response now to the sorts of problems that are being identified by a scheme like COVAX?
No, the response of the West has been not only inadequate, it's been profoundly unethical, because what has happened was that, as you said, the rich countries hoarded all the vaccines, leaving the developing world without any choice and actually paying a very high price for the few vaccines that remain available. So I think the whole way in which the distribution of vaccinations were arranged in the last 6 months, or even last year, because the British government actually bought its doses of vaccines last summer, it showed that actually it's very important to have a production site within your region of the world, because otherwise you are not able to access any vaccines. And I think South Africa is having the help and the support, the full support of the World Health Organization, because the whole question of patents that has to be reviewed. This is almost a form of neocolonialism, a way in which super wealthy, big multinational companies in the West ensure that the developing countries remain extremely poor, and the pharmaceutical companies are profoundly hypocritical on this, because the pharmaceutical companies that have developed the vaccines in the West, they are so reliant on public investment. In the United States alone, over $12 billion of public funds were invested in the research of the vaccines, which now the commercial pharmaceutical companies are reaping the benefits. So this is a world problem. This is a pandemic that has, as the name says, affected the entire world. Patent laws have no place in this situation, because the pandemic will only disappear when the whole world is vaccinated and when the pandemic is under control all over the world.
Since we're not in that position, Steve, and it doesn't look like we're going to be in that position anytime soon, how do we square that with the kind of huge public pressure that's appearing not just in the UK, well, it's very visible in the UK. We're seeing it obviously over international sporting events where, we had people going, we had English fans going last month to Porto for the football, for the Champions League final, and then there were large numbers of infections reported there. And so countries like Italy are saying, no, we're going to have quarantine against English travellers. And we've got the English, meanwhile, inviting UEFA fans to come and watch the final for the Euros at Wembley. I mean, we seem to have kind of contradictory messages on public health against pressures, whether it's for tourism or for big sporting events or for the needs of business. I mean, I just wonder how we're going to find our way through this.
And it's messier than that. So you highlighted the football, where big crowds are going to come for the final stages of the tournament, whereas festivals for music are being, even outdoor ones, are being cancelled. And theatres and concert halls are still struggling with social distanced audiences. So it is all over the place. And the answer is that I think it will remain a mess for some time. And I remember during the G7, and by the way, if they weren't going to announce bigger contributions then, they're not going to happen. That was the stage to do it. People like Gordon Brown warning, we won't be free of this until everyone is vaccinated. So there's a massive self-interest in getting the vaccinations across the globe. But it didn't happen and is not going to. And that will have the consequences of us navigating through this maze of contradictory kind of messages for some time to come.
I mean, in a sense, Thomas, it illustrates the problem that the Prime Minister is experiencing with his health secretary at the moment, which is the public going, well, look, it's do as I say, not as I do, because that seems to be the case. Then there's a big international event we want to host, like the G7, or we want to host the football final, then we kind of blur the rules. We find reins, we find exemptions, we find reasons or justifications for not doing what we've said everybody else has to do.
It would be possible to live with these contradictions for a little while if they were more understanding of what the ordinary citizen this summer, as was last summer, need to feel happier again, to be able to travel and to go on holidays. You're quite right in pointing out, and Steve is on the contradictions, but the bigger problem at the moment is the lack of community in Europe, and I add here the EU plus the UK, about each other's consulting what to do with the virus and so forth. I mean, it's an unconscionable situation. At the moment when Britain puts Malta on the green list, free to travel, that Malta itself responds by barring British tourists from coming to their country. I mean, what does that say about the ability of politicians to foresight and to foresee sort of calamities down the road, and in order to avoid that, get together? I mean, now Johnson is coming, Merkel is coming to Johnson to see him in Chequers a week later. He should have done that much earlier. You should have sought each other's counsel, how to allow certain conditions to occur so that people can travel. I mean, for Angela Merkel to now parade herself as the proselytizer of Europe to stop Britain from entering their continent is the worst situation the German Chancellor of all people could be in. She should instead overcome her anxiety that she has, quite rightfully, about the Indian virus variant, and to consider how, under the aegis of double vaccination that British holidaymakers now mostly would bring to Europe, a certain corridor of travel might be allowed, and even the risks involved can be coped with by sticking to statutory rules. Instead, she goes around and trying to make friends by making enemies with Britain of all countries. So there shouldn't be a shootout between the UK and the EU about how to deal with the vaccination. With the travel problem, you should come together and devise a common policy, a common approach, how to help the European citizen to get some kind of holiday time in this year.
Thomas Keeling, let's hope that the football on Tuesday between England and Germany sets a precedent of good cooperation after a lively competition. Thank you all for a lively contribution. Eunice Goesch, Steve Richards and Thomas Keeling. Thanks very much for watching. That's Dateline till the same time next week. Goodbye.